Hi guys, my name is Deborah. Hi. Sometimes you may see me up here leading worship, but tonight I am going to preach instead. So here we are. This is on something that I've been thinking about for quite a while, something that kind of came to me as I was reading the passage that we're going to read tonight. For those of you who don't know about kind of my journey at Stanford, I have been at Chi Alpha since I was a freshman, since like my first week here. That very first week, I went to Reformation, which is like our first service of the year, and a girl named Madeline, who is no longer here, got my number that very first time, and she texted me like repetitively, like it wasn't just like a waiting for me to respond. It was like, okay, so you want to do this? And so she asked me to go to a one-on-one meal, and I didn't really know what that meant. I was like, that sounds terrifying. I spend time with groups, but I love talking to people, so I was like, how bad can it be? So I went, and that was the beginning of just this amazing mentorship relationship that I had with Madeline. Got to go to her wedding not too long ago. And that just developed into bringing me into Chi Alpha in general. So that was kind of the start of my experience with mentorship. And this passage that we're going to read is just one example of where we see mentorship happening in the Bible. It's everywhere. It's Jesus. It's a lot of people in the Bible that do mentorship. But here's one example. So we're going to read through 1 Samuel 3. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Again, the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. A third time, the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling, as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears about it tingle. At that time I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore, I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering." Samuel lay down until morning and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision, but Eli called him and said, "Samuel, my son." Samuel answered, "Here I am." "What was it he said to you?" Eli asked. "Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you." So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. Then Eli said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. And Samuel's word came to all Israel. Okay, so a bit of context. We are in the Old Testament here, and we get two verses right at the beginning that kind of need a little bit of explanation. So first of all, verse 1, the boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. Okay, so who's this person? Why is he ministering? So Hannah is Samuel's mom, and we learn about Hannah in chapter 1 of 1 Samuel. Hannah could not have a son, but she asked God for a son, and she promised that she would give her son back to God for service in his temple if she had one. Eli actually blesses her when she visits the temple to ask for a son. So there's this like previous relationship that was happening. And then when Samuel was around 3, or maybe a little bit younger, she brought him to the temple. So now, fast forward to the passage where we're at. Samuel is in the temple. He's probably in his early teens or so. He was of the line of Levi, so that was the genealogy, the part of Israel that was in the line of priests in the temple, but no one in his immediate family that we know of, not his father at least, was a priest. So this also is at a time where we're kind of going from judges into kings. So over Israel for a while, chronicled in the book of Judges. Shocking. There were judges that were leading Israel, and that's what Eli was. But Eli was actually also the priest, and so that's why we see him in the temple. But now, under Samuel is actually going to be the first one to, through God's appointment, appoint Saul to be the first king over Israel. So that's kind of that transition period that we're in right now. And then the second bit of context is we see in verse 2, it says, "In those days the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions." This is a little bit unclear. We don't know exactly what this means. We know that just a chapter previous to this, someone actually comes to Eli, has heard from the Lord, and tells him, okay, so your family is cursed. So someone is hearing from God. God is not entirely silent, but it is maybe not as prevalent as it has been at times. And I was talking to Glenn about this, and this is actually not necessarily an unexpected thing in ministries. It happens fairly often in the Old Testament as well as today. In the Old Testament, it might look a little bit different. We do hear a lot of God's revelation because it's the Bible, and so it is God's revelation. But this does happen, and that's okay in some cases. That happens in Chi Alpha, that we may hear more visions or more words of knowledge from some people at some times, and then not at other times. We do know, however, that at the very least, regardless of what was happening in all of Israel, this temple is struggling a little bit, and we see that in Eli's sons. So they've been sinning pretty significantly. It says that they blasphemed God. In the chapter previous to 1 Samuel 3, it says that they were eating sacrificial food that they were not supposed to be eating. And they were also having relationships, inappropriate relationships with women who were serving at the entrance to the temple. So horrible things that have been very clearly spoken against, but they have not yet been disciplined for this. We see that Eli doesn't seem to be quite as close to them. Instead, Samuel almost replaces them, we feel. In this passage, he's lying nearby Eli, whereas we don't really hear about Eli's sons right now. So that's a little bit of context. So we see an example of mentorship in this passage as we read through it, specifically in the service of God, not just like a general wisdom, but to listen to God. But I do want to give a disclaimer. This passage, as you may guess, does not only apply to mentorship, nor do most of the points that I bring out of it. There are things that you can take and apply to any part of your life. So don't just read it this once, think that it's only mentorship, and move on. And additionally to that, Eli was not necessarily the ideal mentor. Obviously, there are some issues there, right? And Samuel was not necessarily the ideal mentee. So each of these things, we need to kind of examine it and not take it as this prescriptive, this is exactly what mentorship should look like, but just kind of what lessons can we glean from it. So with that said, I'm going to go in kind of two parts. We're going to look at lessons for the mentee, so sort of Samuel's perspective, and then switch to lessons for the mentor from Eli's perspective. So starting with lessons for the mentee. And the first one we see here is serve well. So we see that Samuel is serving well from verse 1. He's being obedient. It says Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. We also see that he's serving Eli well. So he runs quickly to Eli in the night when he hears what he thinks is his voice. He was ready to do that, to jump up and do what was needed. And this is important because he's not just listening to Eli's wisdom or training. He's not just kind of sitting back and learning these things, but he is serving him. And this is similar for us to any mentors or really anyone in the church. And that is where mentorship should be happening, right, as we're doing this, is with people that are in your church community. And we see many different calls in the Bible to serve and to submit to each other. So it's not just to listen to your mentors, it's also serve them as you serve everyone. So we see this in Ephesians 5:21, for example. We see submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So that submission part, listen to what they're saying. And then in Galatians 6:9-10, we see, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. So, submitting, serving well. And we see Samuel doing this, he's serving well even in the face of failure in the temple. So we see that there are these huge issues, right? I mean, that's the entire thing that God is speaking to him as a curse on Eli, the priest's family. Samuel was almost certainly aware of the failures of Eli's sons. He's grown up in this temple. He probably knows what's happening. And in this passage, he's told what's happening. And he chooses to serve in the temple faithfully all the same. Now, what's important here is that he's ministering. In verse 1, it says, before the Lord under Eli. Or in the King James Version, the way that it says it in English is unto the Lord before Eli. Regardless of the version, we see that these prepositions are different, right? So he's serving God differently than he's serving Eli. He's serving unto the Lord before Eli. He's serving God, but in Eli's presence. And that's crucial, as just he's not ministering to Eli's benefit or to Eli's son's benefit, because that's not his God. And so I think that kind of is how he is able to sort of avoid Eli's mistakes. His focus is on serving God in the temple and not the family that is in the temple. And we see this also as an important thing to just remember in general, that in 2 Corinthians 4:5, for what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. So just that really crucial for Jesus' sake part. So we see Samuel is serving well. But the second thing we see is that he is listening openly. So Samuel is literally laying in God's presence. We see in verse 3 that it says Samuel was laying down in the house of the Lord where the ark of God was. He was ready to listen. And that may not have entirely been his choice. Maybe that was just the custom, was that you lay near the ark. I'm not sure. But it is certainly a good thing to keep in mind, right? That he's literally laying in God's presence. And he was constantly dwelling in that place. Now, for us today, it may look a little bit different because we don't have like a box that is like God's presence in the corner of the room. And that's really important, that at that time, God's presence was not solely in the temple, but that was a lot of how they thought of it, was for the most part, God dwelled in the temple, in the Ark of the Covenant that he had ordained to be built for his presence to dwell in. For us, that's different. And that's actually really cool because that means that you can dwell in God's presence anywhere. So we actually, when Jesus came to earth, so God's son came down to earth and died on the cross, then symbolically, well, no, I mean, it actually happened, but it was also a symbol. Then the curtain in the temple was torn. So the curtain that divided the most holy place where God's presence was said to have rested from the rest of the temple was torn in two as God died. And because of that, we are able to be in God's presence at all times, at any time when we choose to be. And so I just want to encourage you that we should then go into his presence and listen openly. For us, it may not be going to the temple, but it is choosing to listen and to watch for what God is saying. Now, we also see that Samuel was listening openly not only to what God was saying, but also to what Eli was saying. So whether Eli was going to ask him to do something in the middle of the night or just was going to say something to him, he runs to Eli, right? He's very ready for that. And then he was open to God speaking when Eli said, hey, I think actually God is speaking. He listened, he followed the instruction that was given to him. And he did this with no experience of listening for God. It says in verse 7, Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. So we don't know if this is something that he had eagerly yearned for. Maybe he'd been like waiting for this day, or maybe he didn't even know that this was something that could happen. If the revelation of God was rare, he may not have had many examples of this. But regardless, he was ready for it. He was open to that. And he had been preparing both in obedience in the temple to Eli and also to the people of Israel he was serving in the temple, all the people. Then he was being obedient and he was learning of God's character that prepared him to be able to listen openly for when God did speak to him. So for Samuel, we see that he is serving well, he is listening openly, and finally, he knows that his mentor will fail. In fact, he knows that his mentor has failed. But he also is open to Eli, and that suggests that he knows that Eli is wise regardless of his failures. So he had spent a lot of time with him. He knew every failing, even the ones that aren't mentioned here, right? But he also knew when to trust him. He knew that things had worked out maybe for him in the past. Whatever it might be, he had learned from Eli. And in this case, we see an even more strong, obviously he knew of Eli's failures because Eli is literally helping Samuel, mentoring Samuel into demonstrating Eli's sins through God, if that makes sense. So like, he's very aware. So just for you, as you are in a mentee-mentor relationship, hopefully, just remember you don't have to assume and shouldn't assume that your mentor knows everything, that they will give the perfect answer and it will be straight from God, and that they won't fail, because they will. Even in the things that they're saying you, they will fail. And that's okay. It's okay to be open to that, but don't let your skepticism keep you from ever learning from their experience. Even if you know their failures, there is a reason why they are your mentor, and they have wisdom, and they are hopefully seeking God. And so we do see that Eli recognized, even after a few tries, it took him a little bit, but he did recognize that God was calling Samuel. Samuel had no other experience with that. He would not necessarily have known how to listen for that. But he needed Eli's help, and he recognized that Eli knew how to recognize God's voice. So Samuel served well, listened openly, and knew that his mentor would fail. I'm going to drink water before I move on. I don't like masks. Anyways, now I understand. Okay, so moving on to Eli. What do we see Eli doing? So, as a mentor, number one, know your mentee. And this takes time. Eli literally blessed Samuel before he was born, and then continued to know Samuel and get to know him all of his life. This allowed him to know how to connect with Samuel so that when the opportunity arose, he knew that he didn't have to walk into the room with Samuel and say, okay, now we're going to sit here and listen for God. But he could say, I know your obedience and I know who you are. Go and say this. And he knew that Samuel would do that. And that does take time to develop. And so I recognize that college is 4 years. So if we're talking about mentorship relationships that happen during college, yes, 4 years is not a long time. Speaking as someone who has never lived in one place for 4 years, that is plenty of time for you to get to know someone well. And I promise there is always, when you're moving to a new place, going to be this sense, especially for those of you who are new here, there's going to be this sense of, well, what if I don't get to know them? I'll just have to leave again. Fight that urge. It will always go better if you say, no, I'm going to dig in. I'm going to get to know these people as well as I can. We'll figure that out when we get there. Take it from someone who's done it many times. So it's better if you start right away, right? Don't wait. If it's a short amount of time, then it's not going to help you to wait around for this to happen. Dig in. So number one, know your mentee, and that takes time. Number two, give direction, but not answers. I think this is maybe one of the most crucial aspects of what Eli does. This was the first thing that actually popped out at me that made me start thinking about this sermon when I was reading this passage, was that we see in verse 9 that when Eli recognizes God's voice, he says, go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. He does not offer to interpret what God is saying. He does not suggest what God is saying. He just recognizes God's voice and tells him to go and listen to it. As a mentor, hopefully you are at a place where you are consistently seeking God. You are learning who God is and learning from God's word. And so yes, you should be able to give biblical advice. But you can't relate to God for them. Our spiritual walks are essentially a relationship with God that we are able to have. And that's going to be different for every single person. So don't assume that what your experience is can be directly translated. Allow them to discover that, and God will speak to them in a way that is unique to them and is able to help them develop in their spiritual walk or faith. So just a brief note on this, because this was something that I struggled with actually on the mentee side, was that my freshman year, towards the end, I had these really great mentors who were telling me about their spiritual walks, and I started to identify with their spiritual walks as if I was doing really great because they were doing really great. And that's not how it works. And it was through no fault of their own. They were just trying to give examples of ways that they had seen God work for them. But I just do urge caution of giving biblical advice and giving examples for someone to see how it might happen, how God might work, is not the same as saying, this is what God is saying, you better do this. So just be cautious of how that can be a tendency. So, know your mentee, give direction but not answers, and third, respond humbly when God works. This is true, obviously, not just in mentorship. If the God of the universe says something or does something, respond humbly. I don't care what relationship you're in. But we also see this in mentorship, and specifically when God works in your mentee, right? So we know that, so the most recent time that God spoke to Eli that we're told of was just the chapter before, as I mentioned, through someone else to tell him that his family was cursed. So Eli's not having a great time, potentially. I mean, we don't know, but it seems like probably he's maybe frustrated that God hasn't been speaking to him or hasn't been building him up, and he's been cursing him instead. I mean, this isn't a great time, right? But at the same time, when he knows that God is speaking to Samuel, his response is not, oh, but God should be speaking to me, or wait, let me tell you because don't go listen to it. It doesn't matter, right? He doesn't covet that. He still sends Samuel away to go listen to God. And And so you could argue that what he said in verse 17 when he was saying, okay, actually, could you tell me everything that God said to you was based on this jealousy, this need to know, right? But at the same time, he at the very least doesn't hinder him from hearing God's word to start with, due to pride or jealousy or whatever it may be. And this is especially important because we see that ultimately Samuel would replace Eli. So at the end of this chapter, we see in verse 21, he revealed himself to Samuel, he being God, through his word, and Samuel's word came to all Israel. Now, as a side note, for a place where God's revelation was rare, that's a huge blessing. Like now God is revealing himself to Samuel and Samuel's word is coming to all of Israel. This is huge. We should encourage that, and Eli should encourage that, right? That there's this, God is now moving and bringing him up to take Eli's place, and that's a good thing. We need that to happen, in fact, for leadership and for churches and for community to continue. We need people to be able to take their mentor's place. So don't be jealous, but better yet, it's not just a neutral thing. Let them speak to you and learn from them when they learn from God. That's part of what being in community is about. So what a blessing to learn from them, right? In this case, for Eli, it's a curse. But hopefully, that's not ever what you're dealing with. We're going to assume that's not the common experience. And in this case, we do see that Eli's response in verse 18 is, he is the Lord, let him do what is good in his eyes. So he responds humbly, regardless of what message is coming to him and who it is coming from. He knows that it is God's word. Just as a little side note from my experience with mentorship, my sophomore year, I started mentoring Laura Jaqueline, our lovely Laura, and I loved starting to kind of get that experience with mentoring. Now, I know this is gonna seem a little bit weird because we're like 1 year apart. So it's clearly different from like this Samuel-Eli thing, but that's what we have in college, right? Like you can meet with Glenn and Paula and that's a little bit different, but for most of us, like we're all within a few years of each other. So it's gonna be different, but I think it still applies, that you can still easily be like, oh, but I have 1 more year experience on them, right? Like, we do these things, guys. We get in our head about this. So, well, okay, wait, I do this thing, I get in my head. So with Laura, something that was really cool, is especially over the last 1.5 years or so, God has really spoken to Laura in some amazing ways and has encouraged her. And she would tell me about the things that she was learning from God. And I honestly, just based on what I know about myself, I was shocked that I wasn't like jealous or annoyed by that she was hearing so clearly from God, and that was something I was struggling with. But instead, I actually, especially even just last week, we were having dinner, and then even just tonight, she was praying. I mean, there are so many ways the ways that God is speaking to Laura, she is then able to encourage me with. And if I had closed myself off to that out of some jealousy or pride, I would have missed out on this amazing, just these amazing words from God that I definitely believe he is speaking to me through her. So that is just one example of, I promise it can happen, let it happen, and let it be a blessing to hear from your mentee. Okay, so we see Eli knows his mentee. He gave direction but not answers. He responded humbly when God worked in his mentee's life. And finally, and this is like really emphasized in my notes, which is, anyways, okay, so regardless, your mentee's spiritual life is not your burden, nor is it your accomplishment. And this is something that I have had to work on my whole time at Stanford, and will probably keep having to work on it. Eli failed to understand that it was God twice. We see that, right? And then the third time he's like, oh, wait, I think it's God, go do this. But when he got it, that was great. Even if he hadn't, I still firmly believe that God would have spoken to Samuel. He had already called him 3 times. He could have kept doing it. He would have gotten to it. Our God is persistent and loving. He wants to speak to us, and he does not need a mentor to do that. So don't let that be your burden of, man, if I don't speak correctly to my mentee, they're never going to hear from God. Not true. But by the same logic, don't think that you get the glory for what God does for your mentee. Even if it's something that you said that really like gave them an epiphany, it wasn't you. It is right and great to be happy for how they are growing, but make sure that all the praise for that goes to God. And with that, I think part of what that means is that if all the praise for that is going back to God and not to your own wisdom and experience, then all of your conversations with them should be turning back to him as well, right? This isn't mentorship as like a, let me tell you the class I took and how well I did in it. This is mentorship in service of God. So all conversations should turn back to him. Another thing to just, for me, that has helped to keep that in perspective, that I neither hold the burden nor the accomplishment of my mentees' spiritual walks, is three things. They all have to do with prayer. One, pray for your mentees. Two, pray before you meet with them that that conversation would be a blessing to them and that it would be from God. And three, pray with them while you are meeting with them. And those are three really great ways for you to remember that God is the one who is working in your mentee's life. So for Eli, we see, know your mentee, give direction but not answers, respond humbly when God works, and do not take on their spiritual life, your mentee's spiritual life, as your burden or your accomplishment. Now, this passage, as I mentioned at the beginning, is just one example of a mentoring relationship. There are others. There's Jesus, who disciples 12 people. That's a really great one. I encourage you to go look at that one. There's also an example that Paula shared, actually, my freshman spring, about Moses and how he has relationships with Jethro, Aaron, and Joshua. And I encourage you to look at that, or ask her about that, or ask me about that. I love sharing about it. But these are just some ways to be a mentor or a mentee that we see modeled in the Bible. I firmly believe that with prayer and a genuine will to do God's will, to help him, God, be more known to those you are around, don't worry about the rest. It's not going to be like one misstep. You forgot to pray one time. It's all downhill from here. It'll be okay. It's not a formula, but seek to make him known in your mentee's life. So I want us to just take a second to think about who you are in this story. And if you, like all the way back when I was talking about God's presence, were like, wait, stop. I don't know how to be in God's presence. I don't know what that means. I don't actually know who Jesus is. How do I accept that? That's a great place to be. And a mentor will come, and that will be important. But first of all, let's just think about that. Are you sitting in the presence of the Lord? Do you know how to do that? And if not, do you feel that there's anything that is prompting you to do that? Is this something that you want to tap into, but you just felt like this was like level 3 and you need to like start at level 1? That's fine. We have our Exploring Christianity group that Mina just talked about, which is a great place to start. You can also just talk to anyone here. You can come talk to me. Allow me to tell you, as a temporary spiritual mentor for you in this moment, listen to the prompting you may be hearing about God's presence, or about God, or about Jesus. Listen to that. Try to discover that. And I do think that a mentor might be helpful as you're discovering that. But that's not the first step. Okay, so for those of us who do think that we know how to at least sometimes sit in God's presence, we know ideally what that means. Are you a Samuel? And do you have a good Eli? Are you an Eli and you have a Samuel, or multiple Samuels, but hopefully not too many? Are you lacking a mentor and or a mentee? If you're a freshman and you don't have a mentee, I think that's understandable. It might be a little weird for you to mentor someone that's like literally the same age as you. But if you are lacking a mentor and or a mentee, do not wait. Think about who you might trust to consistently lead you to listen for God. Think about who you could help by reminding them of God's word. And this could be someone that you know is struggling with something you've struggled with. This could be someone that you just click with. Like, it's just so easy to talk to them. This could be someone that you see that you think could use a friend/mentor. They just seem like they aren't quite plugged in yet. Whoever it is that comes to mind, take action on that. If the worship team wants to come back up. I strongly believe that consistent discipleship is preparing people, yes, for leadership in Chi Alpha here in college, and that's huge. As someone who is leaving, I would love to see more and more leaders be brought up and discipled. But I also think that this is a skill that we need to work on, not just for Chi Alpha and your time in college, but to go out and serve future churches as well. This is something that at least most of the churches I have been in have not done very well, this mentorship, discipleship thing. And I think it's really crucial to how we continue to grow together and grow toward God. So I encourage you, while we are all living within not much distance of each other, it is never going to be easier than this. So start sowing those seeds now. Start learning how to do this. Allow yourself to fail sometimes. And that's going to just pay off so much in the future as you go into other churches and continue to be a follower of Christ. So that's what I wanted to share with you guys tonight. And now if you would join us in worship. I just really quickly also want to just pray over our ministry, specifically for mentorship in our ministry. So if you just bow your heads, I know we just prayed, but we're going to do it again. God, I just thank you for your word, that we can just see so many examples of your kindness, that you are persistent and you call after us. God, I pray that we would not be a ministry that hearing your word is rare, but God, would you teach each of us to sit in your presence? Would you speak to us? God, would you just light a flame in each of our hearts to disciple each other as brothers and sisters toward your word? Yeah, God, would we just answer that call, that we would just be able to relate on a deeper level as a community, that every relationship that we have in this room would be so firmly focused on you, that we would all be gradually learning more and more from each other about how we can hear your word, how we can answer to your call. God, I just pray that every single person in this room would be willing to just sit at your feet and say, God, your servant is listening. That would be something that we would do every day and consistently. Yeah, God, I just pray that we would just see the fruit of that in this ministry. In your name I pray. Amen.